Newsologist. One world, many views. Yes, some of them. So the Conservative Tory leadership between Sunak and Truss. Sunak is obviously going down, fighting, and he's basically sort of saying that the policies which Liz Truss alludes to be making are bad. He's saying that what she's doing is unfunded spending commitments, i.e. what that means is there's no income to match the spending. There's no revenue stream. There's no taxation stream. There's nothing to support the money that she wants to spend. And he was having difficulties with the tax cuts and help for families and all of the rest of the stuff. If these policies are enacted, and there's a reasonable expectation that some of them will be, then there's basically three options. Windfall tax on the companies that's making it, the oil and gas companies, those have already basically been announced. Plus the fact is that they're taxed higher than normal companies anyway for North Sea revenue from the oil and gas. Increase direct taxation, well, Truss is going to reduce it, so that's out of the window. So you're back to the old faithful, which is borrow. You're going to need to borrow money to pay for the giveaways, to pay for everything that you're doing over and above what's in your budget now. One of the alternatives, though, could be cut stuff out of your existing budget. Stop wherever you're doing cut back. The difficulty is, where do you cut back? Everybody wants more money every year to do more things. The government keeps getting involved in more and more things. Support London Transport, support the railways, support this, give money to this, give money to that. If there's an increase in the borrowing, and there's an increase worldwide in borrowing, then the money can only come from two places. It can come from existing money which exists, or it can come from central banks digitising and magicking up. If the Bank of England continues to raise rates, the bank rate, which it lends money to the banks at, then the borrowing costs for it will tend to go up. Bank of England is tasked with keeping inflation at 2%. At the present time, it's so far north of that, you can't see it. You can't even see the tail lights of where inflation is now at 2%. It's 10 plus, and these are government figures which some people say are strongly manipulated to give a lower than actual figure for poor families. The gilts are edging the way up, and the sort of 2-year gilt, that's the government debt which is repaid in 2 years, is went up, and it's been at 3%, which it hasn't been for over a decade. So Sunak, he's firing the broadsides, basically saying, pointing out the adjectives, it's irresponsible. It would be complacent not to be thinking about the public finances, the risks to the public finances, blah, 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 blah. It may be worth listening to if this lad hadn't been the Chancellor who threw money around like a drunken person that works on a ship when they're docking port. Some of the things which he put money into during the Lurgy days, when you look back, you've got to question. Perhaps it was done with good intentions, but it hasn't worked out that way. We're back to, where does the money come from? To attract world money, you need to give enhanced rates. That'll draw foreign money in, which will obviously they have to change their foreign currency. Get yourself down to Thomas Cook, get your £1 billion traveller's cheque changed into squids, and hot-tail it round and buy yourself £1 billion worth of gilts at the Bank of England window. There you go, all done. If the Bank of England doesn't raise the rates sufficiently and doesn't attract enough money in, foreign money, or money in the UK to buy its gilts, then the government ends up buying its gilts itself. It does this by printing new money and buying the gilts, putting it on its books. Fancy term is QE, quantitative easing, basically pushing money out into the economy. One of the major results of this is obviously asset prices tend to go up. Assets such as shares tend to go up to reflect the inflation of putting more money into the economy than there's goods or services to balance it. He then alludes to the Bank of England being independent. The Bank of England is owned by the British government. Allegedly it was made independent when the Blair government got in 1997, and there was a big hoo-ha with Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor at the time, saying, he's making it independent, blah, 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 blah. But the Bank of England works within constraints, and the remit of the Bank of England is to keep inflation within tram lines, if not exceeding 3, and not going below 1%. The target is 2%. If it moves outside of those tram lines, the Governor of the Bank of England has to write to the Chancellor Exchequer and the Treasury and tell them his recovery plan, how he intends, unless it's a she, how they intend to get inflation back to 2%. Bearing in mind there's a lot of conjecture that inflation is another manipulated government statistic. Truss, on the other hand, she's wanting to review the remit. We need a remit review. She's been sat in the cabinet for the last few years. I'm not too sure if she ever brought up the remit review, but now she's the front runner. She's remit and reviewing away, and she's basically saying, you've got the tools, get on with the job. You can raise the rates as high as you want. I want to see that inflation down. Keep raising the rates, keep squeezing the money out of the economy. The knock-on effect tends to be that you increase the unemployment rate. Small firms suffer, people can't afford things, firms lay people off. There's a knock-on effect. It reduces the taxation base. One of the things which the Treasury introduced was inflation-linked gilts. These are the normal gilt. It comes with a stated yield on it, 2%, 3%, 4%, Treasury for XYZ date, blah, blah, blah. And that's what you get, obviously, is the interest rates change, the effective yield that you get changes on their bond. The inflation-linked ones link the yield which they pay to the inflation rate. Approximately 1/4 of the government's debt is in inflation-linked gilts. So as the Bank of England merrily ratchets up the interest rates, then the yields, the effective yields on the normal gilts go down, but the yields on the inflation-linked gilts go up, because if inflation's high, your effective yield that you're getting on your bond keeps pace to some extent with the inflation. So the UK is more at risk than most of the other G7 major Western economies, because the UK has a higher percentage of inflation-linked debt. We're now getting into bandying around sort of numbers. That's always a good thing. So Sunak is saying that Truss is wanting to borrow an additional £50,000 million to fund her programme. The difficulty with these big numbers, £50,000 million and all the rest of it, is how does that equate? How does that equate to a normal person? £50,000 million. Well, if you say that the UK population is 69 million, so divide 50,000 million by 69 million, break that down, it's the same as 50,000 divided by 69. Works out at a little bit over £700 per head of population in the UK. If you basically say nobody under 20 and nobody over 60 effectively works in the UK, obviously there is some people that do, but the bulk of the population, because obviously there's unemployed people between the 20 to 60, and basically each person in the country that's working has to be carrying the debt burden for someone else's as well. So if you take that 700, double it up, call it 1400, round it off to 1500 for discussion, making a nice round number there. That's the amount of debt which Sunak is saying that Truss wants to lay on every person, working person in the UK, on the basis of one worker, one person not working, little kids, people at school, people in sixth form, old age pensioners, all of that. So you say £1,500, that's a lot of money, another £1,500. But you've got to realise that £1,500 doesn't have to be paid back for the length, the term of the bond. And just say, for argument's sake, that the gilt goes out with a yield of 3% on it. So that's £1,500 times 3%, that's £45 a year. Rounded off to 52, we'll call that £1 a week. So Truss has to increase people's taxes by £1 a week to cover her £50,000 million loan, the equivalent of. So the other way around it is that she borrows the money to pay the coupon off each time it has to be paid. So all she's having to do is, if it's twice a year, she's only got to borrow 50p for every person in the country that's working. So that's half. So that's 25p. So that's 69 million people. 69 million people times by 25 pence. Next to nothing. It's only £17 million. She's only got to borrow £17 million every 6 months to pay and maintain this 50,000 million pound. All it is just 50,000 million, blah blah blah. You divide it by that, times it by that, 3% this, blah blah blah, split into two. So it's not a lot of money to be able to borrow a huge amount of money, dole it out, bread and circuses. Let's get down to the Colosseum, hoist some Labour MPs in there with the lions and tigers, and get a bit of sport, you know. Meanwhile, you can reduce these bills, which is what it's after. So it's eminently fundable. It's not a big deal with that. People get confused with the top line money, the amount of money to borrow. This is the same as your visa bill. You know, you pay the minimum wherever it is these days, £5 or whatever. You know, you can have a couple of grand clicking away that you've had access to. That's what people do. The only way you can get around this is if you bring into legislation that the government is restricted to how much money it can borrow, some hope with that, and to have a balanced book situation where the amount of money that the government spends has to be balanced by taxation, no external borrowing, some hope with that. So that's not going to happen. So we're back to the situation that we've got. Truss, she's out there wanting to reverse tax rises. She's wanting to have a little bit of a mini budget, emergency budget, an emergency mini budget, blah, so that she can give some of this 50,000 million squids, okay, and everybody will regard her as a hero. Yay, thanks for doing that. It will not have any effect on people's opinions. Labour people will still vote for Labour people, Conservative people on the whole will still vote for Conservative people. It might change a few people in the middle, but I'm unsure. The election will show that in a couple of years' time. There's also talks about cutting income tax, cutting value-added tax, but at the present time there's nothing firm coming out. This should all happen quite quickly once on the expectation that Truss is going to win, and on the expectation that she announces this mini super duper giveaway budget reasonably quickly. But I would imagine there'll be a period of reflection and great of one. How can I ameliorate people's expectations down to a realistic amount of giveaways? I'm not too sure where Sunak's coming from, but he's basically saying that Boris, everybody knows who Boris is, don't have to use the surnames with them. Okay, Johnson's going to continue as an MP, but he's saying that he should move over, shouldn't be in the frontline politics, as that time's over. One of this could be Sunak playing the long game. The long game being, I want to be Prime Minister. I'm going to throw mud at Truss, but I don't want to have a toe-to-toe with Boris in any leadership race. The expectation is, and I would think there's a reasonable percentage chance of it happening, that Liz Truss, when the next election is run, she's no longer the Prime Minister. The normal thing that happens in the Conservative Party when they lose election is they get voted out. It's reasonably normal in the Labour Party as well. So Sunak sits there in Parliament. He's got all of the texts. He's got all of the tablets. He's told you that this is going to turn to a pile of excrement. He sits back, waits a couple of years. Truss gets beaten in the next election. Truss gets hired out. He comes back, says in a polite way, I told you so, you should have listened to me, blah blah blah. He then gets made Conservative leader. He then does 4 or 5 years in opposition. By that time the Labour Party will have possibly got itself into a mess. There might be a change of government. So Sunak could be looking 7 years down the line. I could be Prime Minister. He only has to realistically hang on for 3 years. If the alternative happens and Truss wins the next election, then I would imagine that Sunak would be on his toes, and 6, 9, 12 months after the new parliament's formed, he'll be quitting to spend more time with his family. So it could be a good ploy from Sunak. He's certainly going to be one of the front runners as a element of the Conservative MPs, a reasonable percentage of them, will vote for him. I think that's why he's trying to spike Boris's guns now. What Sunak doesn't want is next election, Truss gets booted out, loses the election, we need a new leader, it's Boris too. By that time, all the indiscretions, the parties, all of that stuff is long gone in the past. People have been faced with 2 or 3 years of gas conflicts, all of the rest of the stuff which flows underneath the river of politics under the bridges. People have a warm glow about Boris too. They remember him. And here presto, Boris too comes out of the woodwork and becomes Prime Minister again. What Sunak wants is he doesn't want Boris hanging around for that. He wants Boris to exit stage 11. Once again, this shows the divergence between members of Parliament and the electorate. You've got a huge number of MPs resigned from Boris's government, yet the bulk of Conservative Party members that were polled basically said that if it had been a 3-horse race or even a 2-horse race, Boris against Sunak or Boris against Truss, that most of them would have voted for Boris. So Boris is Cinderella and the other two are the ugly sisters. They're not universally liked. It's hard to tell in politics. It's hard to tell with Truss. I tend to think with Truss that her personality, which came through as Foreign Secretary, is not well suited to being the PM. You can't just browbeat people. Some of the speeches which she made on the Ukraine versus Russia conflict were too severe. She put herself into a cul-de-sac that she can find difficulty getting out of. Although politicians can always do 180 reverses, that's not new. But I do not think she will be successful. I hope she is for the country, because if she's unsuccessful, means a lot of people in the country is going to be worse off, and you don't want that. But I don't think her personality is suited. It's not quite as badly suited as what May's was. If ever there was a person that was unsuited to be the Prime Minister, you can say that for a lot of people, but I think it was blatantly obvious to a lot of people that May was in no way, shape, form person that could handle and manage to be the Prime Minister. Possibly in less trying circumstances, but May became Prime Ministeress when Cameron did a runner after the Brexit election referendum. She wasn't suited when she was Home Secretary, and she exemplified how she wasn't suited when she came into the PM slot. She didn't solve any problems, she exacerbated them. I tend to think Truss will be May, but just not quite as bad. I think she'll hoist some money at these things. The external effects, Macmillan week in politics, the external effects is what drives whether you're good or bad. If the war in Ukraine stops overnight, then Truss will have a far easier time. They might manage to get inflation down a bit. The oil prices, if in a year's time the war in Ukraine is still rocking on and there's been big disruptions over the winter time period, winter 22-23. Depends also what's happening in Europe. I would imagine if there's massive problems in Europe this winter, there might be some minor cracks in the EU and in their attitude towards the Russians and buying oil and gas from them. It's too far in the future to be able to say. You can go down too many rabbit holes. The rabbit hole that I've went down is Truss is going to win. Truss is going to borrow this money. It's easily manageable as long as you don't have to pay the capital back. But isn't that the way with the government? That's why the government's ended up with a debt north of £2 trillion. 2 trillion is 2 million or 2,000 billion. The numbers are just astronomical. The interest payments on that are astronomical. The capital is astronomical. That's why the capital never gets paid back. Some of this 2 trillion is, if you trace it back, is for money that was borrowed decades, centuries ago. The actual bonds will have been paid off, like the First World War gilts and stuff like that, and the Second World War when we had to pay the Yankees. But the debt never get expunged, never got taken down to zero. There's an element, we're probably paying for HMS Victory in washing down the deck after Nelson got shot. There's a penny in there somewhere for that in this 2 trillion. The debt never gets paid off. That's why they can do it. All the politicians have to do is pay the interest. Well, the citizens and the companies in the country have to do that. That's the shell game. That's the con game. Get the money, spend it, make everybody feel happy, and then it's just paid back at £5 a week on the never never, forever and ever. Time to put the kettle on.